I was holding my daughter in seat 14A, trying everything I could to calm her down. She was crying so hard her little body shook. I'd already given her the iPad, the snacks, her favorite blanket. Nothing helped. The man across the aisle leaned toward me, loud enough for the whole row to hear. "You shouldn't fly if you can't control your kid." I froze. My mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. My daughter, Lenny, just kept crying, saying one word over and over. "Daddy." Her voice cracked every time she said it. I finally looked at the man and whispered, "I'm sorry." His eyes narrowed like that wasn't enough. He sighed, leaned back in his seat, and muttered something else I couldn't hear. People around us shifted in their chairs. One woman gave a sharp glance. Another rolled her eyes. I felt all of it. The judgment, the annoyance, the weight of being the mother who couldn't keep her kid quiet on a plane. But none of them knew. Not yet. They didn't know we were flying home from my husband's funeral. They didn't know Lenny had clung to the side of his coffin just 2 days earlier, refusing to let go until I picked her up and carried her away. They didn't know she hadn't slept a full night since, and they didn't know that this flight wasn't just hard, it was unbearable. A few rows up, a flight attendant noticed. She started walking toward us. I didn't know what she was going to do. I braced myself, expecting to be told to quiet my child or move to the back. But she stopped right beside me, looked down at my daughter, and did something I'll never forget. She took the intercom microphone from its holster, turned to the cabin, and said calmly, "This little girl just came from her father's funeral. Maybe we can show her some grace." The entire plane went silent. "My name is Alina Mara. I'm 33. I used to be a kindergarten teacher. Now most days I'm just trying to get out of bed and make it to the next one without falling apart. 4 days ago I was planning my husband's funeral. 2 days ago I watched our 6-year-old daughter touch the side of his casket and ask me why he looked like he was sleeping. This morning, I packed a tiny pink backpack full of crackers, crayons, and tissues and boarded a flight with her, heading back home to Phoenix. Julian was my husband. He was a firefighter, brave, steady, the kind of man who read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. We met when I was 17 and he was 19. He taught me how to drive stick, how to roast marshmallows without burning them, and how to believe I was stronger than I thought. We were married 8 years. We had Lenny 2 years after our wedding. She looks just like him. Same dark brown eyes, same cheekbones. She was his shadow. He used to say, "Lenny's not just my daughter, she's my best little buddy." He took her to the farmer's market every Saturday and made pancakes with smiley faces every Sunday. When he was on shift, she'd sit at the window for hours waiting to see his truck come down the block. Last week, he never came home. There was a warehouse fire in Joliet. The floor collapsed. He and 2 other men fell 30 feet into the basement. Julian was pinned under steel beams. They said he never had a chance. The knock on the door came at 4:27 in the morning. I knew. Before I even opened it, I knew. Lenny woke up an hour later, rubbing her eyes and calling for him. I couldn't answer her. I didn't know how. I sat on the floor of our bedroom and cried into a towel so she wouldn't hear me scream. We flew to Chicago for the funeral. That's where Julian's parents live. The service was beautiful, if that word can even apply. Firefighters came from 3 different states. His helmet sat on the coffin. A folded flag was placed into my arms. Lenny sat on my lap the whole time, staring straight ahead. She didn't cry at the funeral, not one tear. She didn't speak at all until we were alone in the rental car that night, when she said, "Is Daddy still at work?" It broke me. Now we're here, on a commercial flight filled with strangers who know nothing about us, nothing about what we've been through. Just another mom with a crying kid, just another person disturbing the peace. We were flying home to a house that no longer feels like home. I kept thinking about Julian's coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter, his boots by the door, his toothbrush in the holder. I hadn't touched anything. I wasn't ready. Lenny had barely spoken since the funeral. She wouldn't let go of the elephant stuffed toy Julian gave her on her 5th birthday. She clutched it with both hands while we went through security, while we sat at the gate, while we boarded the plane. I'd hoped she would sleep, that maybe the sound of the engines would calm her. But once we were in the air, the pressure built in her ears, and she began to cry. First soft, then louder. She cried like something inside her cracked open. I tried everything. I offered her a granola bar, her favorite coloring book, the iPad with the bunny cartoon she used to love. Nothing worked. I didn't blame her. She missed him. She wanted him. And deep down, I think she realized that no one was going to tell her it was all a mistake, that he'd be home in the morning. That moment, the one where a child stops hoping, is the one that shatters a mother. So there we were, me trying to calm her with a half-whispered lullaby, and her crying into her elephant. People around us were getting annoyed. I could feel it. I could hear the sighs. I could see the sideways glances. And then came the man. "You shouldn't fly if you can't control your kid." The way he said it wasn't just annoyed. It was sharp, like a knife disguised as advice. His tone told me that I had already failed in his eyes, that he didn't care about the reason, just the noise. I wanted to disappear. I hated that I even said, "I'm sorry." Not because I didn't feel sorry, but because I felt forced to apologize for something so much deeper than inconvenience. I glanced down at Lenny, who was red-faced and sweaty from crying. She looked up at me and whispered, "I want Daddy." I wrapped my arms around her. "I know, baby," I whispered. "I know." The sound of a cart rolling down the aisle barely registered at first, but then I saw the flight attendant coming. Not hurried, not stern. Calm. Observant. She didn't look frustrated. She didn't look judgmental. She looked human. She knelt beside our row, asked me softly if I needed anything. I looked at her, unsure what to say. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to cry in front of more people. But I answered honestly. "We just buried her dad." She nodded slowly. No questions, no lecture. She stood up, walked away. I watched her go, unsure if she'd return. I didn't know what she was planning to do, but what she did next would silence that entire plane and change everything. Lenny's sobs only got louder. The engines hummed in the background, but her cries cut through the cabin like glass. I could feel the tension around us tightening. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some looked out the window, pretending not to hear. Others didn't bother pretending. The man across the aisle, mid-50s khakis button-down shirt, Bluetooth earpiece still in, let out an exaggerated sigh. He adjusted his seatbelt with more force than necessary and shot me another glance. I avoided his eyes. I held Lenny tighter, trying to rock her gently against my chest. Her tiny hands clutched the stuffed elephant, damp now from her tears. She kept saying the same words, over and over. "I want to go home. I want Daddy. I want to go home." I whispered back, "We're going home, baby. Just a little longer." But she didn't stop. Her cries weren't tantrums. They weren't stubborn or manipulative. They were deep, raw. They were pain-made sound. I reached into the seat pocket and grabbed a napkin to wipe her face. My hands shook. I was sweating through my sweatshirt even though the plane was cold. The woman in front of us turned slightly and looked over the seat. Her brows were tight, her lips pressed together. She didn't say anything, but her expression said enough. I turned back toward the window, willing myself not to cry. And then the man across the aisle spoke again, louder this time. "This is ridiculous. You shouldn't fly if you can't control your kid." I didn't even look at him this time. I just whispered, "I'm sorry." That was all I could manage. I wasn't going to argue. I didn't have the energy. I didn't have anything left to give. My grief was a weight on my chest, and now I was drowning under everyone else's judgment too. Lenny buried her face into my neck, sobbing harder. Her little voice cracked between words. "Why did Daddy have to die? I want Daddy!" I closed my eyes. The pain hit me in waves. I wanted to scream, to run, to vanish. I wanted to reach back through time and pull Julian out of that building. I wanted to shield our daughter from a world that could tear her heart apart before she even learned how to spell grief. Instead, I sat in a cramped airplane seat, trapped 30,000 feet above ground, surrounded by strangers who were more bothered by the noise than the reasons behind it. The man across the aisle kept muttering, and now a couple near the emergency exit began exchanging comments. I caught the words, "some people, kids, and shouldn't be allowed." Lenny's sobs hiccuped. She wasn't calming down, just exhausting herself. I held her tighter, whispering into her ear, "It's okay. "I've got you. I'm here. Mommy's here." She didn't hear me. Her grief had deafened her to everything else. I felt completely alone, and that was the worst part. Not the public shame, not even the comment. It was the loneliness of knowing that no one in that plane understood what we were carrying. That loneliness, that silence from everyone else, hurt more than the man's words. The flight attendant hadn't returned. For a second, I wondered if she had changed her mind. Maybe she had gone back to the galley to avoid the drama. Maybe she thought I should be handling it better, too. I glanced around. Row 13 looked away when I caught their eyes. A teenager with headphones on across the aisle gave me a half smile, but it faded quickly when he noticed the man glaring at me. There was nowhere to go, no space to breathe, no one to help. And then, just when I felt like my heart was going to break under the pressure, I saw her again. The flight attendant, Miss Calloway, walked steadily down the aisle toward us. Her expression was unreadable. She wasn't carrying water or snacks, just walking with a purpose I didn't understand yet. She paused beside my seat and looked at Lenny first. Then she looked at me. Her voice was soft. "Do you need anything?" I wanted to say no. I didn't want to burden her further, but the words came out before I could stop them. "We just buried her father. 2 days ago. We're trying to get home." Miss Calloway nodded slowly. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make a face. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply nodded. And then she walked away. I stared after her, confused. Not disappointed, just unsure. I didn't know what she was doing, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel, for the first time since the funeral, like someone saw us. Not just the noise, not just the chaos, but us. Lenny was still crying. Her voice had gone hoarse. I didn't realize I was crying too until I felt the tear slip down my cheek and land on her forehead. We sat there in the quiet storm of our pain, surrounded by people who didn't understand, while a woman we barely knew was about to remind them all what compassion looked like. The tension in the cabin stayed thick, like a storm waiting to break. But something was coming, and I didn't know it yet, but in the next few seconds, everything was about to change. The plane hummed on, steady and indifferent. Outside the window, clouds stretched out like soft gray fields, endless and cold. Inside, the tension around us hung thick and heavy. Lenny was still crying, her voice raw now, broken down from the weight of it all. My shirt was damp where her tears had soaked through. I rubbed her back in small circles, over and over, more out of habit than hope. No one had said anything kind. No one had asked if we were okay. The silence from the other passengers was louder than the engines. I felt like I was unraveling in plain sight, and everyone was just watching it happen like a show they didn't ask to see. But I kept holding her. I kept whispering to her, even though she couldn't hear me through the noise inside her head. I had no plan, no solution. All I could do was survive the next minute, and then the next. Then I saw her. Miss Calloway, the flight attendant, returned. She didn't have water or snacks or coloring books. She didn't look rushed or stressed. Her steps were slow but certain, her face calm and unreadable. She stopped at the front of the cabin next to the intercom panel. Passengers noticed her. Some looked up, maybe thinking it was just another seatbelt reminder or drink announcement. A few ignored her completely. I watched her, confused. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular. She stood there for a second, and then she picked up the microphone. Her voice filled the cabin. Not loud, but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask for a moment of your attention." I sat up a little straighter, still holding Lenny in my arms. Her breathing slowed slightly as she turned her head toward the sound. The man across the aisle glanced up, looking annoyed but curious. Miss Calloway continued, "There's a little girl in seat 14A who's been crying for some time. Some of you may be feeling frustrated or disturbed by the noise. Before we go any further, I'd like to share something important." She paused only long enough to shift her eyes down the aisle. Then she said it. "That little girl just came from her father's funeral. He was a firefighter. He died in the line of duty 3 days ago. Her mother is doing the best she can. So maybe, just maybe, we can show her some grace." Silence. Not awkward, not stiff. Real silence. The kind that fills you with stillness because you suddenly realize something bigger than yourself is unfolding. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I felt 100 eyes shift toward us, but this time the stares weren't sharp. They weren't annoyed. They were softer. Some were full of guilt, some sympathy. One woman pressed her hand to her chest. A man 2 rows ahead reached for a tissue. Lenny didn't understand the announcement, but she felt something shift. Her body relaxed against mine just a little. Her cries turned to hiccups, quieter and slower. I looked at her and brushed the hair out of her eyes. The man across the aisle looked down at his lap. He didn't say another word. I kept my eyes on Miss Calloway. She didn't make a grand gesture. She didn't wait for applause or recognition. She just nodded once, quietly put the microphone back in place, and returned to the back of the plane. That was it. A single moment. One voice. One act of courage. But everything changed. The woman in the row ahead turned and leaned back, her voice gentle. "I'm so sorry for your loss." I managed to nod, afraid I'd cry if I spoke. A teenager 2 seats down rummaged through his backpack and handed Lenny a small box of crayons. "These helped me when I was scared on my first flight," he said. And then someone passed us a small, soft plush elephant, different from the one Lenny held, but similar enough to feel familiar. It came from a woman near the rear of the plane. I looked back to thank her, but she just smiled and waved. I kissed the top of Lenny's head and whispered, "Look, baby, you're not alone." In that moment, everything that had felt cold and hostile was warm again. Not fixed, not healed, but human. Miss Calloway had made a choice. She could have walked by, she could have said nothing. Instead, she used her voice to speak the truth the rest of the plane needed to hear. She reminded them that behind every cry is a story, and behind every mother is a reason. And in doing so, she gave us something I hadn't felt since the moment Julian died: dignity. After the announcement, the energy on the plane changed. It wasn't immediate applause or dramatic gasps. It was stillness, thoughtful, weighty stillness. For the first time since we'd boarded, no one seemed to mind the sound of a child crying. In fact, it was quieter now, not just from Lenny, who was slowly tiring out, but from the passengers themselves. Conversations hushed. The judgment evaporated. What filled the space instead was awareness. Awareness of the grief seated in row 14. The man across the aisle didn't meet my eyes. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his tray table, glanced out the window, and stayed quiet. The harshness in his posture faded. His hands, once crossed tightly over his chest, rested more loosely in his lap. I didn't need an apology. I didn't expect one. What I needed, what Lenny needed, was what we had just been given: space to hurt without being punished for it. Lenny's sobs had softened to little tremors. Her head rested against my chest, and her thumb found its way to her mouth like it used to when she was smaller. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes blinked heavily. I rocked her gently. I hadn't moved from that position for what felt like hours. That's when a woman from 2 rows back stood up and walked over to us. She looked about 60, with soft silver hair and kind eyes behind square glasses. She bent slightly to our level and spoke just above a whisper. "My husband died last year. He was a police officer. We had a little girl, too. I know how hard it is." I felt the tears rise again. I hadn't cried in front of a stranger until that moment. Not like this. Not with my whole body. I nodded, unable to speak, and she gently touched my shoulder before returning to her seat. She didn't linger. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. A minute later, someone reached across the aisle. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, with a tattoo of a rose on her forearm. She held out a packet of tissues. "I don't know what to say," she said, "but I'm really sorry you're going through this." I accepted the tissues and gave her a quiet thank you. My throat was too tight for much else. But the gratitude I felt was overwhelming, not just for the tissue or the words, but for the humanity in her face. She saw us. She didn't look away. Row by row, people began to open up in their own small ways. A man offered Lenny a sticker book. Another gave me his unopened granola bar. A woman, toward the front, flagged down a second flight attendant and asked if there was anything more they could do for the little girl in row 14. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was real. The thing that struck me most was that none of it would have happened without Miss Calloway. She had taken a risk. She had stood in front of a crowd of strangers and told them a story they didn't ask for. She reminded them of something they should have known already. that grief doesn't come with volume control, and pain doesn't ask for permission. She could have stayed silent. She could have followed procedure and moved on. Instead, she used her voice to make space for mine and Lenny's. She gave us dignity. She made room for compassion, and the passengers followed her lead. As Lenny finally drifted to sleep in my arms, I leaned back into the seat. My body was tired. My heart ached. But for the first time since Julian's death, I didn't feel alone in it. I looked across the aisle at the man who had spoken so harshly. He sat stiffly, arms crossed again, staring out the window. I wasn't angry with him. Not anymore. People don't always understand what they're seeing. It's easier to judge a crying child than to imagine the funeral they just came from. It's easier to blame noise than confront grief. But now, he knew, and that mattered. The plane continued its course west, somewhere over the middle of the country. Outside the window, the clouds parted just enough to reveal streaks of orange and blue, the early signs of sunset bleeding into the sky. It was quiet in the cabin, not tense, but peaceful. Something had settled, a kind of reverence maybe for the fact that we were all sharing space with more than just luggage and seatbelts. We were sharing it with each other's stories, each other's broken pieces. Lenny sighed in her sleep. I brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her little elephant was still clutched tightly in one hand. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "We're almost home, baby." And for the first time since we boarded, I believed it. When the wheels touched down in Phoenix, Lenny was still asleep against my chest. Her little mouth was open, her hand still curled around the ear of the stuffed elephant. I didn't want to move, not yet. I wasn't ready to stand up and re-enter a world where our life looked the same from the outside, but felt completely unrecognizable. Passengers began gathering their things. Seatbelts clicked open. Carry-ons were tugged from the overhead bins. The usual rush to get off the plane had begun, but something was different this time. It was quieter, more careful. Like people understood that this wasn't just another routine landing. The woman with the silver hair gave me a soft wave as she stepped into the aisle. I nodded back. No words. Just a shared understanding. One parent to another. The young woman with the tattoo stopped as she passed me. She reached into her bag and handed me a small folded piece of paper. I opened it as she walked away. In simple handwriting, it said, "You're doing better than you think." My throat tightened again. I tucked the note gently into the side pocket of my bag. Then I saw Miss Calloway. She was standing by the front of the cabin, thanking passengers as they exited. When it was our turn, she looked directly at me, then down at Lenny. "She stayed strong," she said quietly. "So did you." I swallowed the lump in my throat and whispered, "Thank you for everything." She gave a small smile. "You're not alone. Just remember that." And then we stepped off the plane. The airport was busy, as airports always are, but the noise felt different. Lenny stirred, blinking in the bright light. She looked around in confusion, then at me. "Are we home?" "Almost," I said, brushing her hair behind her ear. I carried her all the way to the baggage claim. She was heavy in my arms, but I didn't mind. I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I watched people rushing to find their bags, meeting loved ones, tapping at phones. None of them knew what we had just lived through in the sky above them. But I knew, and I would never forget. In the days that followed, the house felt heavier than I expected. Julian's things were still where he had left them. His boots were still by the door. His badge still hung from the hook in the kitchen. I kept thinking I would hear his keys jingling, his voice calling out from the hallway. Lenny would sometimes wander into the bedroom, pause in the doorway, and ask, "Do we have to live here without him now?" I didn't have an easy answer, but I held her close and said, "We'll live with him in a different way." We started making small changes. I framed one of Julian's old t-shirts for Lenny's room. We lit a candle next to his photo every night. We began a new tradition, writing letters to him every Sunday morning. Lenny would draw pictures. I would write words I couldn't say aloud. It wasn't the same, but it was something. That flight taught me something I didn't expect. It taught me that pain doesn't have to be invisible to be respected. It reminded me that even when people don't understand what you're carrying, they still have a choice in how they respond. One woman chose to speak, She used a few words at 30,000 feet to crack open a cabin full of strangers and fill it with empathy. That moment will stay with me for the rest of my life. And to the man across the aisle, I don't hold anger in my heart. I hold understanding. Because grief is a language not everyone speaks. But kindness? That one is universal. To anyone who sat in public with a crying child and felt the burn of judgment in every direction, I see you. You are not failing. You are not weak. You are carrying more than most people ever notice. And to every flight attendant, every stranger, every person who chooses grace instead of criticism, thank you. Because grief doesn't always look like a black veil or quiet tears. Sometimes it looks like a tired mom holding a broken little girl on a crowded flight. And sometimes all it takes to soften that pain is one person brave enough to say, let's show some grace. We all land somewhere eventually. Some of us just need a softer place to touch down. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or a moment you'll never forget, share it. Let it remind someone else that kindness matters, even when we don't know the whole story. If you've ever had a stranger show you unexpected grace, or if you've ever been that person who stood up when it counted, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to read today. And if you believe the world could use a little more empathy, please like this video, share it with someone, and subscribe to the channel. We're building a space here for real stories, for healing, and for reminding each other we're not alone. Thank you for watching. Take care of each other.